Welcome everyone to Cornell Keynotes. On today's show, we're going to cover immigration law and policy changes that might occur during the second Trump administration. Joining us today is moderator Steve Yale-Loehr, who is professor of immigration practice at Cornell Law School and director of the law school's Immigration Law and Policy Research Program. Joining Steve as presenters today are 5 visiting immigration scholars in the program at Cornell Law. We have Marielena Incapié, we have Charles Kamasaki joining us, Amy Nice, and we have Teresa Cardinal Brown and Randy Johnson joining us as part of today's panel. Viewers, in a few moments, we're going to ask you to participate in the discussion as well today. So I want you to get your phones ready for a QR code that's going to display, or alternately, you may click the URL that's going to appear in the chat if you prefer to respond in your browser via computer instead of using your phone. During today's conversation, heads up, we're going to be sharing a few links in the chat with you. For instance, Charles Kamasaki's book, Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die. We'll share the URL for that one. And also heads up for a link to Immigration Reform, A Path Forward, which is a white paper published by Steve and a few of our panelists that proposes 3 targeted immigration reforms. And bonus, there's a companion keynotes podcast that we recorded in support of this white paper publication as well. So we'll make that available for download for you as we get going here. Viewers, I hope you find these resources useful in broadening your understanding of the critical issues covered in our keynote today. Consider this optional homework, but I think some of these additional resources will bring you more clarity and understanding around the topic of today. So as we warm up here, let's check in with our audience. Viewers, as mentioned, it's your turn. So we've got 2 questions coming in sequence. I'll ask you first. The first question is simply, do you support mass deportations, right? So shoot that QR code, answer that one question. Once we've got a little bit of info in there, we're going to shoot the second question to you. So Steve, over to you. We planned this webinar this keynote back in August. It was in the middle of a red hot presidential campaign, if you recall. And now that we know who the next president will be, we have decided to discuss possible immigration changes in 3 segments arranged chronologically. Number 1, what can be done between now and Inauguration Day on January 20th? Second segment, possible administrative and legislative changes in the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And number 3, some longer term changes that we may anticipate. So Steve, let's take a look at some of these poll results and let us know what you think of these. This is question number 1. Do you support mass deportation? Overwhelmingly, we've got a no in the top. I can't quite see the percentages there, but enough to suggest it isn't going yes top, no bottom, right? So it's no up top. For the second question, Marcus, let's kick up those results as well. And for the second question, you recall, we asked, should Congress increase the number of work visas? Let's take a look at that one. And then Steve, I'll let you comment. There we go. So those are our results there. Steve, any thoughts on these? Any surprises?
Not necessarily, no. I think that people are trying to figure out what we mean by mass deportations, what we mean by increasing work visas. So I hope that this hour will help to educate people what the options are. And first, let's start with what might happen between now and January 20th, while the Biden administration still is in power. Marielena, let's start with you. What do you think immigrant rights advocates and stakeholders are doing to prepare for the next administration?
Yes, thank you, Steve. So we've had about a year to prepare or more to prepare for the Trump administration. Many nonprofit organizations and philanthropy and many stakeholders, including state and local governments, have been looking at Project 2025 and Project 47, which are the blueprints that the Trump campaign has been using, where they've been very clear about what their plans are. And so some of what's happening in preparation for now that we have the election results and we know that we're having a second Trump administration, a couple of things are happening. One is organizations like the National Immigration Law Center, American Immigration Council, National Immigration Justice Center, and the ACLU are preparing litigation. Second, we've got state and local governments, right? State attorney generals, state governors are also preparing about what they can do, both in terms of litigation, but how do they protect all of their residents, not just immigrants, but all of their residents. And I'll talk more about that later. And then immigrant rights advocates are also, and many law schools are also preparing immigrant communities through Know Your Rights, workshops, webinars like this one, materials, including templates for a power of attorney, for guardianship. And these are important because for immigrants who may be caught up in mass deportation, workplace raids, et cetera, it's important for parents to have someone who will be in charge, who's going to pick up their child from school at the end of the day if that parent gets detained, who will have guardianship, who will have access to their bank accounts if they get detained and are deported, who will pick up that last final paycheck when that workplace raid happens and that person gets put into deportation proceedings. So there's a lot of work that's underway. One of the other things is, particularly because we're at Cornell, international students are also preparing. During the holidays, many international students leave the country to go spend the holidays with their family members. Well, one of the important recommendations is that international students return to the United States before January 20th, and I would say that's probably true for everyone traveling who is not a U.S. citizen, to return before the inauguration, because we do not know what will happen once the Trump administration comes in terms of blocking the border and perhaps not allowing people back into the U.S.
So Charles, what other things should people be thinking about doing now? For example, if someone needs to file for a work permit renewal, should they be doing that sooner rather than later?
In general, I think while everybody's situation is different, and people should definitely consult with a qualified legal services provider before they do anything. In general, I think the answer is yes, that folks are being encouraged to apply for benefits or things like work permits that they're entitled to. Second, just as important, is advocates are pressing the Biden administration to process pending caseloads, which in some cases can be quite large, as quickly as possible to make sure those are done consistent with the policies of that administration and frankly, long-time immigration law. Third, many of us are pressing both the administration, state, local governments, and for that matter, private philanthropy, to expand funding for legal services because so many people will need that. Whether those are people facing deportation or those are people seeking some sort of lawful entry. And finally, I think there's a lot of thought being put into kind of novel legal issues, questions like, can the Alien Enemies Act, which was the statute that was used to justify the detention of Japanese Americans during World War II, or the Insurrection Act, which theoretically could suspend many aspects of due process that most Americans, I think, take for granted. I think there's a lot of research being done on those kind of novel legal issues.
And one thing I would add is that individuals who are sort of in what I call a liminal or gray area status, like temporary protected status or parole, that could be taken away, should try to get a consultation with an experienced immigration lawyer to see if they have any other options to remain here in case those statuses do get terminated. The problem, as you pointed out, Charles, is we simply don't have enough immigration lawyers to provide such advice. So that's a problem. Amy, let me ask you a question. You used to work in the White House and you have been very involved with reforming various rules over the years. The Biden administration has some rules that it has come out with. And one, for example, would reform the H-1B temporary work visa program. Is there a chance that could get finalized before January 20th?
I think that there is a chance. At this time it's unknown whether it'll be published, but the H-1B modernization regulation, as you suggested, has been worked on for about 3 years, with the idea that even under the current statute, the Department of Homeland Security could do more things more clearly. Among other things, this particular rule would require that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services give deference to their prior decisions that involve the same employer and the same foreign-born employee, would require USCIS to provide maintenance of status for international students when they have an employer that recruited them on campus and is sponsoring them for a work visa, and would clarify exactly when petitions for H-1B status that are not subject to the statutory numerical limits can be filed. In order for this to be a final rule before Trump 2.0 starts, it has to be published in the Federal Register no later than December 18th, because this type of rule requires a 30-day delayed effective date, meaning January 17th, 2024, the last business day before inauguration. Another rule, Steve, that I should mention in that same vein that's been worked on over the last 3 years is an effort by the Department of State to reimagine when J-1 visa holders are subject to a 2-year home residency requirement. For the last 50 years, the State Department has simply asked home countries if they want people to return home, but under the controlling statute, that doesn't seem to be the best approach in the 21st century. We think this rule is likely to be finalized in early December and expect that many countries will be removed from the list requiring this 2-year return home.
Great. Randy, let me turn to you. You were Vice President for Immigration and Labor at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for many years, and you've seen a lot of legislative battles over immigration. Is immigration legislation possible between now and the end of the year? I mean, Congress is back in session right now as what we call a lame duck session before the new Congress convenes in late January. What is possible, and frankly, is it at all likely to be anything happening?
Yes, thanks, Stephen. And of course, as you know, we have been working with Congressman Suozzi and Luttrell, Suozzi being a Democrat out of New York, Luttrell out of Texas, on a draft bill. That was a good bill. I mean, it had a lot of strong border stuff in there, asylum reforms, which not certainly everyone liked. A lot of money, but it had DACA reform in there. It had the idea of applying for asylum at mobility offices outside of the country, relief for nursing shortages, Afghan relief. Even the ag bill was in a draft outline. And look, we were somewhat optimistic that we could work towards a discharge petition, which I know is inside baseball, but would go around the speaker and bring that bill up, thinking that Republicans retiring might want to join such an effort. But with the results of the election, I think it's quite clear that the speaker is going to put a lid on everything on immigration, waiting likely, and we can talk about this later, passage of H.R. 2 when they return, but that nothing's going to happen along those lines, unfortunately. And I would predict when they come back after the Thanksgiving break, they'll probably come in for 3 or 4 days and perhaps even leave quickly. So the depressing answer to your question is no, nothing in lame duck.
Well, Teresa, let me ask you. I mean, there are certain things that Congress has to pass in the lame duck session. They have to figure out appropriations, for example, and there's the National Defense Authorization Act. Is there any possibility immigration could be attached to one of those must-pass bills?
I think there is a possibility that some small things could be attached. Usually every year there are some renewals of things like the authorization for E-Verify or changes to the H-2B category, allowing for the administration to add extra visas. These have been attached to appropriations bills each of the last several years, generally on a bipartisan basis. So I do think there's some options there. The Democrats still control the Senate. President Biden is still the president who has to sign bills, and that means the negotiations for the remainder of this year will include the Democrats. And so they can try to get some stuff on there. Republicans, knowing that they will have both the Senate majority and the House majority next year, may be reluctant to do so. It's an ongoing question right now whether or not they would actually finish a full year appropriation for the this current fiscal year before they leave in December, or they would essentially kick the can into the next Congress by a continuing resolution, which is a short-term funding bill that would let the next Congress take up the full appropriations. That's an outstanding question because even Republicans aren't sure what's the better tactical play for them. Obviously, they would have more leverage when Trump becomes president and Republicans take control of Congress, but that limits the time that the Trump administration and Republicans would have to do the budgeting for the next year. And they have a lot of things they want to try to do on the budget for next year. So I think that there is opportunity from some small things to go legislatively this year on either the defense authorization or on the appropriations. But it's still a little uncertain how that's going to play out. I'd also say that there's a premium being placed right now in the Senate on seeing how many judges that President Biden has nominated can be confirmed before the end of this Congress. And that will probably be very important as we're all definitely looking, as Mary Elena said, next year to a lot of litigation around immigration. And so obviously, if there are more judges appointed by a Democratic president on the bench when those lawsuits come forward, many immigration advocates believe they might have some better chances as they go forward there.
Great. Well, speaking of next year, let's segue into part 2 of our presentation. That's talking about the first 100 days, beginning with January 20th. Maria Elena, President Trump says he's planning mass deportations as soon as he is inaugurated. What does that mean, and is it feasible?
That is the $64 million question, Steve, right? We don't know. They have been very public, and this has caught a lot of public attention. One of the things that we do know, if we look back in history, because the Trump campaign has talked about Operation Wetback as one of the models that they're looking at that, and that was back in 1950s. That was targeting Mexican immigrants in particular. And there, under President Eisenhower, we saw that even Mexican U.S. citizens were wrongfully deported because often what it means in practice is racial profiling. What we are likely to see under the Trump administration at the very least is a lot of aggressive workplace raids. And we saw that at the end of the Trump administration back in his first administration, where they basically came into factories and terrorized immigrants who were then detained, and there was a lot of racial profiling, and it disrupted entire communities and impacted entire communities. And so that at the very least is what we're likely to see. We're also likely to see, and one of the things that the Trump campaign has talked about is partnering with local law enforcement, like sheriff's departments, but also with private contractors and possibly even engaging the military. That raises major constitutional questions about whether they can in fact do this. It raises questions about due process and equal protection, and the proper role of the military in terms of targeting civilians in the United States rather than foreign targets. So there's a lot of questions. I think there's a lot that can be done to protect. And I think this is one of the places, again, where state and local governments are going to have a very important role in blocking those efforts as well. And that businesses also need to step up and protect themselves as a business entity, but also their workers.
So, Teresa, what are some of the logistics that would be required to actually deport many people?
Well, I think the logistics are what probably initially at least going to be the biggest limiting factor to how much an incoming administration can do. We have been hearing that President Trump is determined to declare a national emergency. What that does effectively is give him more flexibility to move money and resources around the federal government to put towards this deportation operation. Maria Elena mentioned that there has been talk about using the military. Exactly in what capacity they would use the military is to be determined. Probably the easiest thing for them to do initially is use the military to help with detention, set up tent facilities or operate detention facilities for people that may be arrested. Giving the military authority to arrest individuals under civil immigration law in the United States, that's definitely a legal issue that would be litigated. I think that unlike Operation Wetback, the laws have significantly changed on that since 1950s and what is authorized to be done. So whether or not the Trump administration would try to do that, they would definitely face some legal challenges there, I believe. The other thing is, though, to what extent state and local law enforcement might get involved. Obviously, there are places in the United States where jurisdictions have decided that they do not want their state and local law enforcement entities engaging with ICE on immigration enforcement. There are other places in the country where those entities do engage regularly in helping ICE. And so depending on where people live, they may see joint operations between Immigration and Customs Enforcement and local sheriffs or local police. That is also a place where you could see state and local law enforcement authorities that are willing offer their jails as detention facilities. The government does contract with state and local governments for using certain jail facilities for immigrant detention already. That could be expanded. So these are the kinds of things that I would see initially. Workplace raids, as Maria Elena said, could be sort of the first things that we see that would make major news and splashes. Those are operations that do take a little bit of time to set up and to organize, because they're not necessarily things that can be done right away. But certainly within the first few weeks or a couple of months, I could see that happening in certain places. The Trump folks have talked about some of the cities where they targeted during the campaign as places they might want to try to do that initially. The second half of the equation, though, that's about arresting people. That's about taking them into custody. The second half is a lot more difficult, and that is, how do you determine whether or not they can be deported? Setting aside whether or not the Alien Enemies Act would even apply here, the normal course of a deportation proceeding would require these people to go through immigration court hearings, and that would require a lot of time. It's important to also understand that the expedited removal authorities that currently exist only at the border are not currently in play inside the country, although they could be. And the Trump administration did try to expand those authorities when it was last in power. That was litigated, and the Biden administration came in and rescinded that before that could be finalized. That may be one of the first things they try to do, but that might require full regulatory action, not just a policy memorandum. And so that could take a while before they'd have those authorities. So the process that detained immigrants might go through is one of the logistical hurdles. What's the capacity of the system to process those cases? And then even for those people that maybe they're arresting that have existing deportation orders that would not have to go through another immigration court process, the process of actually deporting people, sending people to another country. We know that there are many countries, particularly Venezuela, where we know that we have a lot of people who might be susceptible to immigration enforcement in a Trump administration that are not willing to take back their citizens. So if they're not willing to take them back, what happens to those people? Where would they go? And there are other countries where we have difficulties as well. So those are some of the process and just logistical hurdles. Do we have enough planes? Do we have enough deportation agents to do all the processing, the immigration courts? Those are the things that I think would be the initial limiters on how big an effort and how many people we might actually see deported in a Trump administration in that first 100 days.
So Randy, Teresa pointed out that we may see some workplace raids early on in the Trump administration. What is the business sector doing to prepare for such raids?
Well, first of all, Steve, there's a lot of lawyers in the I-9 enforcement area. They're going to have an easy time of making their billable hour quotas in the next 6 months and not making light of a terrible situation. But I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of people in the business community on labor issues, which is my other hat, think this administration will be quite favorable on things like wage and hour issues or OSHA, or you go down the list, the overtime regs, independent contractor. It's a totally different scenario with regard to immigration and how this administration is going to approach employers. And I think it's going to be a lot of bad news, worse than I anticipated, as I've talked to practitioners, which their bottom line is, hey, we're trying to get our clients ready for the storm. And Teresa and Mary Elena went through a lot of what could happen. I would recommend to those listening with regard to workplace, separate out workplace raids from I-9 audits. And with regard to workplace raids, you may want to get on DHS's website and look at what happened just a few years ago with regard to Mississippi raids of companies. You may want to pull down a book about Fisher Homes and what happened when actually under Chertoff when ICE went in and for 3 years beat up on that company. But with regard to workplace raids, I think it's going to be a lot of bad news, worse than I anticipated, as I've talked to practitioners, which their bottom line is, hey, we're trying to get our clients ready for the storm. And I think it's going to be a lot of bad news, worse than I anticipated, as I've talked to practitioners, which their bottom line is, hey, we're trying to get our clients ready for the storm. And I think it's going to be a lot of bad news, worse than I anticipated, as I've talked to practitioners, which their bottom line is, hey, we're trying to get our clients ready for the storm. And I think it's going to be a lot of bad news, worse than I anticipated, as I've talked to practitioners, which their bottom line is, hey, we're trying to get our clients ready for the storm. And I think it's going to be a lot of bad news, worse than I anticipated, as I've talked to practitioners, which their bottom line is, hey, we're trying to get our clients ready for the storm. And I think it's just to get an idea of sort of the practical reality of what can happen when the government comes in. They can take a very, very harsh role, discovery, etc., shut your business down. Of course, if you have undocumented workers, that's going to be a problem. But what are all these companies being advised? Hey, this ain't labor issues. This stuff is coming at you, and you need to be ready. And you need to look at your I-9s. You need to clean up your books. I'm not saying you retroactively change records, but you need to clean up your books. If you obviously find out some workers are undocumented, you're going to have to let them go. I mean, I know the more sympathetic thing might be to keep them on, but it's illegal and you're going to get caught. And Steve, I want to point out that it just occurred to me listening that, we're in this situation possibly where employers are going to look at the paperwork again and say, oh, now that I'm looking at it a second time, actually this paperwork doesn't really look correct anymore. And I thought it was correct. And we're going to have to let this person go. Well, that brings into possibly being hauled into court or hauled in before the Department of Justice on discrimination basis, on the basis of national origin. So again, that's the old catch-22. But the real lesson lawyers, law firms are telling business community out there is this is no joke. There's a lot of focus on mass deportation. That's half of the equation. This is the other half. The government is coming after you, and it's not going to take long for them to ramp up. And worksite enforcement sweeping through your workplace can lead to a lot of disruption. You need to anticipate that, but do the simpler things first. Get your I-9s in order and be prepared.
Great. So Charles, all this is going to cost money. How is the Trump administration going to pay for this increased enforcement, hiring more ICE officers and immigration judges, et cetera?
Well, I think you hinted at that at the very top of the show, Steve. How one defines mass deportation and how large a scale is really one question. And the president-elect, as well as the vice president-elect and others associated with the incoming administration, have said vastly different things. Some have talked about trying to deport 20 million people. Others have said we'll start with criminals first, or people with final orders of deportation. There's a very large gulf between those two bookends. So that's, I think, one question. Obviously, the more people you try and remove, the more expensive it'll be. Second, Teresa already hinted as well at one angle, which is to try and move money around. And the Trump administration did some of this. Listeners will recall, or viewers will recall, when they moved some Defense Department money to try and build the wall. And during the administration, I was actually previous Trump administration. I was talking to someone close to the administration. I said, "Geez, isn't that probably illegal?" And this person said to me, "Yeah, we'll probably lose in court, but guess what? They can't make us unspend the money." So I think that's kind of the attitude one would expect going forward. Third, there is the federal budget and the appropriations process. So one part of that could be the continuing resolution that Teresa talked about, and the other is something called budget reconciliation, which I know Randy will talk about as well down the road. So there are lots of potential ways that the administration could try and pay for some level of deportations wherever they end up.
Amy,
Yeah,
let
and
me
Steve,
turn
I
to
can
you.
just
Go ahead.
So sorry, I was just going to add to this last piece. I think because listeners and because this has been in the press so much, one of the things we really just don't know. We don't know how this is all going to play out. And so on the one hand, it's important for immigrants and immigrant allies to prepare for the worst. Partially is this is a campaign and president-elect that is unconventional. And so it's very possible that what we will see is, will the private sector come in and help out with some of the expenses? Will Elon Musk and other billionaires that are now, cabinet elect or others in the orbit help provide the planes and other things, other costs that are needed? The other piece is some of this is also about theatrics, right? It's about the images that they will be able to show to cause fear and panic. Part of the underlying strategy of the Trump campaign that actually dates back to even the state anti-immigrant laws is the attrition through enforcement, which is let's make people's lives, immigrants' lives, so horrific that people will self-deport. So that will be a big part of the strategy, is how to make things really bad and show, and again, I use theatrics in quotes, but to instill fear so people will just leave on their own. That's one of the ways that they will try to mitigate some of the costs.
Great. So Amy, let me turn to you. You worked in the White House and participated in drafting executive actions. You also helped draft immigration regulations. What other executive actions or regulations might President Trump issue early in the administration besides the ones we've already talked about?
Well, I want to say for folks listening in, how the realities that Charles and Randy and Teresa and Marilena just described play into and are connected to executive orders and presidential proclamations generally. It kind of relates to the point that Marilena just left us with about theatrics. An executive order or presidential proclamation can never create new authority for a president or a department or agency to do a thing. Executive orders and proclamations have to rely on authorities that already exist for a president or department or agency to do a thing. So the point of such orders and proclamations is to prioritize actions and to get credit, the theatrics, for the thing that you're announcing. Once issued, an executive order or presidential proclamation is relied upon by departments and agencies to galvanize action and provide a policy justification for taking action. With regard to this first constellation of mass deportation related, worksite enforcement related, who are we deporting, how are we paying for it, all of those things could be subject to an executive order or presidential proclamation. But as my colleagues have discussed, there is authority to do a lot of those things. The press and the conversation might be explained away and driven by President Trump has issued an executive order or president proclamation, but those are things that just can happen. So to answer your question, I just first wanted to make sure we have a level set on, are these actually new announcements and new authorities? No, they never are, but it sounds like that. I think the kinds of things that we'll see besides those that are related to the deportation and worksite enforcement and so forth are things that are related, repeated from Trump 1.0, like to set out a Buy American, Hire American proclamation or executive order about sort of a constellation of things that will be galvanizing the Trump administration to take action in various ways, including on immigration, about who gets hired and the systematic way that the immigration system supports or doesn't, the hiring of the right skill sets for the right people under our existing statute. So I think the bottom line is that we're going to expect to see processes and logistical hurdles of the type that Teresa was talking about being supported by, or how to get over those process and logistical hurdles being supported by executive orders and proclamations, and that we'll see some of the same things that we saw the first go around that were later undone by President Biden about Buy American, Hire American, about travel restrictions and so forth.
Hey, Steve, Randy,
Yes.
can I just jump in? I forgot to mention that expect, and this is very important for your listeners, a strengthened refocus on subcontractor joint employer relationships during the workplace raids I-9 audit process. We all know that many employers legally have moved many obligations off to subcontractors, but there's been a suspicion that this has been done by some to hide their I-9 obligations or roll off to the subcontractor to hire the undocumented. This has been an ongoing theory in immigration law and I-9 enforcement, but because it's a big issue generally in labor law writ large, I wanted to mention it and make sure your listeners knew that this was clearly going to be a focus of this administration.
Well, and we have some experience with this. When Arizona passed its very tough anti-immigration law in 2004 and which actually, or 2008, which preceded the 2010 law, you saw a massive increase in people who were suddenly self-employed. And you did not see what many predicted was a massive outflow of people from the state. So I think that what Randy is talking about, employers retaining those workers, but just calling them contractors, is something we might expect employers to start doing.
All right, Elaine,
Um,
let me jump to you. Oh,
I was
Teresa,
just
did
going to
you
add
want to add
something.
something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add something to what Amy said about presidential proclamations and executive
Yeah.
orders that come from the White House that order departments and agencies to prioritize certain things. The authorities to do things very often are vested not in the president, but in the secretary of the department or agency. And this is true of immigration law specifically. And so it is whatever the president puts in his declaration then has to be carried out by the government agencies. That can be done in a number of different ways, depending on whether or not, for example, there's a new regulation required. That brings in the whole Administrative Procedures Act and a lot of process. But a lot of things can be done by memorandum, can be done by policy priorities. We've seen, for example, significant changes in enforcement priorities by memorandum. And that can be done or undone. So the timing of these things, probably will see a lot of big executive orders issued within days of a new administration taking office. The subsequent memorandums or regulations from the agencies are where the specifics of that will be listed. And it's worth paying attention to all of those levels of paperwork, if you will, from the government because that will let people know exactly how this thing is going to happen.
Great. Arlene, let me turn to you and ask about other executive proclamations or actions that the president might take more internationally, whether it's Title 42, refugee cuts, et cetera.
Yeah, so one of the things, again, that the Trump campaign has talked about is on day one, they plan to shut down the border, and that will require executive orders. Unlike the first Trump administration, where towards the last couple of years we were dealing with the COVID pandemic, Title 42 will not be an option for them. Not that it was a legal option for them back then, because it was, again, they pretended that the immigration people who were coming at the border, that they could block them because of the health crisis in the United States. But they will very likely reinstate what's called Remain in Mexico, which is requiring people to stay in Mexico pending their applications, particularly for asylum. One of the things, again, to remember about the Trump administration, this was true in the first Trump administration and will absolutely be true in the second administration, is that the rhetoric is about undocumented immigrants, but in fact, the policies are about chipping away at legal immigration. And one of the ways that they do that is by executive orders and other policy changes at the border that prevent people from legally applying for asylum, legally entering as refugees. We saw I think it was the number of refugees allowed under the first Trump administration decreased historically to about 25,000 total. And we'll likely, again, see more of that. Public charge restrictions were another policy. So that was an executive order that took them quite a while. They leaked that back in February of 2017 and didn't finalize the rule. But because the Biden administration did take care in making sure that all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted when they issued their revision to the public charge rules, that would take some time for the administration to make those changes. But we should absolutely be very vigilant of what kinds of policies the next administration will take that curtail legal immigration, both at the executive branch, but then we also now have a trifecta. And I absolutely expect Congress, that the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, to enact legislation that will be with us, probably like 1924, restrictions that will be with us for decades to come.
Charles, do you want to add something to that?
Just very briefly, it's something Marielena and Teresa know about more than me. And one of the other ways we saw in the last Trump administration where legal immigration was slowed was what was called then extreme vetting. That is going beyond what the law or the regulations actually require to then subject applicants for visas to other forms of vetting, And that, I think, had a very significant effect in reducing legal immigration.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, a couple of things. One is those are the kinds of policy and process changes that can go somewhat under the radar, although the Trump administration likes to publicize them anyway, but they can go somewhat on the radar in that they are process changes that are put in place within the process that exists now that you don't necessarily know are there until your case gets stuck. Or you get a notice of intent to deny or a request for evidence that seems, where did this come from? We saw that under the first Trump administration, particularly with, for example, H-1Bs, significant increases in requests for additional evidence. Just everything took a lot longer. And that meant that not all the cases that they usually would decide in a year got adjudicated. And so some green cards didn't get issued. The refugee numbers are within the purview of the president to set, and President Trump did set the lowest standard since 1980. And the system suffered from it. The nonprofits that resettle refugees lost a lot of funding and had to downsize, and it took many years of the Biden administration to rebuild that. So if the Trump administration were to do that right away, that would also immediately decrease the number of refugees resettled. Something else I just want to point out, because your original question was about international aspects of this. Remain in Mexico cannot be put in place by the Trump administration unless Mexico agrees. I already mentioned the challenges of deporting people to countries that don't like to take back their deportees. The Trump administration, when it was in power last time, did work with Mexico, sometimes under threat of tariffs and other retaliatory actions, to get cooperation in many ways. The Biden administration did too. They got Mexico to agree to take back people from Cuba and Nicaragua and Haiti and Venezuela who were expelled under Title 42, which was actually in place under the Biden administration longer than it was in place under the Trump administration. But Title 42 would not have worked at all if Mexico was not willing to take back some of those people. I do expect that whether or not, Title 42 as it was in place was attached to the COVID public health emergency that has now been formally ended. But I would imagine that the Trump administration would come in looking for other reasons to use that law. Maybe they would claim that immigrants coming at the border represented a different kind of health threat. I don't know. But because that kind of expulsion authority is expansive, they might look to reinstate some of that. The other thing the Trump administration did last time around was negotiating something called asylum cooperative agreements with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. I think the Guatemala agreement was the only one that actually was activated, but got those countries to agree to take back people and have them apply for asylum there rather than in the United States, a sort of safe third agreement. So I could see those kinds of negotiations also taking place under the Trump administration. So I think there's a lot of ways in which some of the ambition of the Trump administration has to go through what other leaders of other countries are willing to do. And that can take some time to negotiate and do. So maybe some of those things may not be things that the administration could do immediately if there's not immediate cooperation from those other countries.
Great. Randy, let me turn to you. If President Trump, for example, were to terminate temporary protected status or humanitarian parole or deferred action for workers in labor disputes, that would have a big impact on the labor market. What is the business sector's perspective on how to deal with all of this?
Yeah, and I would say in terms of supporting those steps by the president, the business community was fairly muted, not wanting to delve into certain political battles, but nevertheless, behind the scenes was supportive because they do need the workers, Steve. And as you noted, I was with the chamber, so this is going to happen, and I hate to use the word hope because I know this is going to be devastating to so many families, but certainly I would hope one residual effect of this would be to put more pressure on the business community to both recognize that they're losing the workers they need, but therefore they need to get behind some type of legislation on Capitol Hill to create expanded numbers for worker visas. I do think this is one area personally, Steve, that the Trump administration might be sympathetic to, putting aside some comments by the vice president. But it's different than asylum. It's different than amnesty. It's sort of a straightforward way to bring in workers legally, which administration has said it supports. And if we could get union buy-in to offset the argument that this undercuts American workers, I think this is something we could see some progress on. There is a Smucker's bill has been introduced last year. As Amy knows, because we worked together on it, there was a bill, S744, that had a W visa in it that was expanded worker visas for immigrants. So I'm hoping, despite the fact of this bad churning, that there will be this residual effect of creating more of an incentive to get the business community to work on a worker visa program, and that the Trump administration, I think, could very well be open to it.
Great. Marilena, do you think there'll be litigation to challenge some of these new executive orders and other things?
There will
stating the obvious, duh.
Yes, there will absolutely be litigation, Steve. So a couple of things. I mean, the one is just even to piggyback on what Randy just said. I really hope that the business community does not only engage the second Trump administration on getting work visas, but actually on getting a path to citizenship, right? Green cards and work authorizations for their workers, for the very workers that have been here for 10, 15, 20 plus years, paying taxes, who have U.S. citizen children who are integral to our communities. And what we did see during the first Trump administration is we did have the business sector join amicus briefs in some of our lawsuits. At the time, I was at the National Immigration Law Center, and our lawsuit, for example, against the Trump administration with the Muslim ban, or when the Trump administration tried to end DACA, the business sector did play a role, as did universities. Universities, for the first time, were joining amicus briefs. They were, university presidents were issuing op-eds, for example. So this is a moment for no one to sit on the sidelines and for everyone to play a role in helping to shape the America that we believe in, that we could and should be. And in addition to that, states are already getting prepared for litigation. So states like Washington, California, Massachusetts, New York, who have very strong attorney generals, have already started preparing for the litigation to protect all of their residents. The last piece, and then of course the nonprofit organizations will do so as well, filing lawsuits to block, or at the very least delay, the harm of these policies. The last thing that I'll say is that one of the things I'm really looking at, just connecting the dots on some of what we've been talking about, is during the campaign, we've heard some mention of calling red states like Texas to use their National Guard to go into blue states that have sanctuary cities or are not cooperating with the Trump administration. If that were to happen, there will be absolutely litigation from states that are quote unquote blue and litigating against red states. And we will be at the brink of constitutional crisis in this country in a way that we've never seen before since the Civil War. And so I do want to note that as something else. Again, how much of it was rhetoric during the campaign versus how much of it will the Greg Abbots of the world from Texas and DeSantis actually follow suit on.
Teresa, you've been following litigation very closely over the years. And if I remember one comment you made, you said that these days courts are sort of the final arbiters of immigration policy decisions these days. Do you think that's going to increase in the new administration?
Well, I think everybody was nodding their heads. Look, consistency of litigation is probably the one certainty we have. It has been prevalent in every national immigration policy, frankly, since the Obama administration and the first lawsuits against DAPA, the expansion of DACA in 2014. The fact, as Marilena said, that increasingly states are litigants, not just, standing on the sidelines and amicus, but actual litigants in these cases, does raise constitutional questions, because we are looking at states suing other states or the federal government and vice versa. The difference this time from the last time of the Trump administration, I think, is the effect that Trump had on the federal judiciary when he was president. He managed to put an awful lot of his own judges on the bench in these federal courts, including in what traditionally been very liberal courts, such as in the Ninth Circuit, that may have different ways of evaluating the similar types of cases that we saw in previous Trump administration. Obviously, the Supreme Court is now a 6-3 conservative majority. That will matter for the cases that make their way to the Supreme Court. So I think it's not at all certain that even similar cases on similar things would go the same way this time around as maybe they did in the first Trump administration. And that may mean that there has to be some consideration of which cases move forward. To Maria Elena's point, though, I think something we also kind of need to understand. I know we're at the beginning of a Trump administration. It is a 4-year term. We have elections in 2 years that may or may not change the Congress. And one of the things that Trump himself has been very, very good at through litigation is delaying the impact of things. Trump cannot run again. And in 4 years, there will be another president. So some of the strategies may be limit harm where you can, delay things where you can until another administration comes in and maybe things can change. But I absolutely expect that there will be as much, if not more, litigation this time around than there was in the past Trump administration, or even that we saw during the Biden administration.
Great. So we've been talking about what may happen and a lot of policies that may hurt immigrants and families, employers, and the country as a whole. Let's see if we can end up on a little more positive end note. What might happen that could be positive? Charles, let me start with you.
Well, looking through the lens of history, which increasingly I'm inclined to do, perhaps due to advancing age, if you really zoom out, this is by far, I mean, this is hardly the first anti-immigrant period that we've experienced in this country, right? The first was already mentioned. The last time the foreign-born population got to be about 15%, we saw the enactment of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, very restrictive national origins quotas, which really reduced immigration up through the mid-1960s. Then the so-called Operation Wetback, in quotes, that Maria Elena mentioned was actually not the only mass deportation in our nation's history. There's a very rich literature out there, some of which is summarized in my book, that documents some 4 major mass deportations in our history, including one during the Depression that probably deported more than 1 million U.S. citizens. We've bounced back from those, right? So arguably that period led to the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which rapidly and vastly expanded both the level and diversity of legal immigration to the U.S. So if I were to, looking through the lens of history, try to look forward, most recently we saw the Trump administration in its first iteration having to pull back from its harshest policies when it was faced with family separation at the border and much publicity about that, as well as kids in cages. I suspect the minute that mass deportation starts to really affect U.S. citizen kids and U.S. citizen spouses, and literally you have cameras seeing American citizens seeing their husbands who have lived here for a long time, worked, paid taxes, not gotten in trouble with the law, being ripped from their arms and marched to a deportation bus, I think that starts to turn the tide a little bit. And finally, I would just say there's been a lot of attention to the Latino vote in this last election and the number of Latinos who may have voted for Trump. And I tend to doubt the accuracy of the exit polls, but there was some unmistakable movement in that direction. Again, looking to history. In the 1950s, the vast majority of Latino scholars and organizations and advocates were actually pretty anti-immigrant, as was organized labor during that period. And it was Operation Wetback that began to change those minds when they began to see U.S. citizen kids in particular being affected by deportations that it just hadn't occurred to them. And so when you talk to Latino voters, when you listen to them, when the prospect of mass deportations comes up, they don't think it's the kind of mass deportations we've been talking about. Many of them will say and have said publicly, oh, we didn't think Trump is going to do this. Or it was only about the criminals, only about the bad actors. And I think to the extent they go far beyond that, we may see public opinion begin to change.
Amy, let me ask you next. Is there a possibility that businesses may want to actually support legal immigration in the next Trump administration?
Well, we hear a lot of talk about how Elon Musk is a big believer in high-skilled immigration and that we should all rest comfortably to know that it's just going to be the criminals, first of all. Second of all, it's only going to be undocumented immigrants. And I think as we've heard extensive conversation today, there's nothing that we know from how Trump 1.0 operated or what the authorities are for Trump 2.0 that make that likely, that it's just going to be limited in that way. I think the thing that, to play off Charles's historical point, that could relate directly to skilled immigration and actually making some inroads into modernizing, updating our legal immigration system under Trump 2.0 is that there's going to be a recognition that quickly that we the people want workers. And as Marielena made the point just a little while ago, workers are skilled in many ways, in many places. They're already embedded in our communities and our employment and our employer communities in many different sectors, geographies, industries, different sizes of companies. It's not just on a piece of paper, a thing where you can separate workers and people and the activities that we all care about across the country. So there's some idea and some hope that businesses and the business community will have an opportunity to work with some members of Congress to reimagine a legal immigration system. But, I think it's also true that, excuse me, in Trump 1.0, there were efforts, by the Jared Kushner branch of the White House, by the Larry Kudlow National Economic Council branch of the White House, to also take on legal immigration. And they really couldn't get around the reality that Stephen Miller and others who had the ear of the president were controlling the agenda. So I think that all of us here who are scholars in the immigration law and policy research program are standing by to help and to assist and are hoping that there are such opportunities. But it's also realistic to think that it could take the sweep of history, as Charles was trying to educate us on, before we could actually get there. It's possible, but it might take a longer window of time than this 4-year Trump administration.
Marielena, what role can states and local governments play in helping on this situation?
Yeah, so I just want to echo again what Charles shared and Amy. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I think we have now entered into a really, really dangerous period in our history of the United States. And my hope lies in state and local governments and advocacy at the state and local level. I'm looking a lot at history these days, and this too shall pass. The question is, how long will we be in this very painful period in our history? And state and local governments can still do so much to protect their residents, to ensure that everyone in those states have a freedom to thrive. And that includes everything from education, economic policies, policies that lift the floor for all children to have food at the end of the day, to have housing, climate change issues, right? So there's a lot that affects our day-to-day life that we'll be looking to state and local governments for. The other thing that I would say is that because I do think that this is a moment of major restriction, like the 1924 Act, I'm looking at the next 20 plus years, right? I'm hoping that it's not going to take us 40 years as it did from the 1924 Act to the 1965 Act to get back to a more welcoming place in this country, but actually that this is the moment for us to be seeding and building communities, building bridges across ideology, across race and class and gender, and building multiracial movements that will be the ones that will get us through a better day to the country that we need to become.
Great. Well, unfortunately, we don't have any more time. We could discuss this for hours on end. I hope we got the highlights at least to you. We do want our viewers to educate yourself about our complicated immigration system. We will put some resources in the chat, such as our Cornell Immigration White Paper and links to the project that we do at the law school to give consultations to DACA recipients. Contact your member of Congress on whatever immigration issue is important for you. You can certainly help immigrant organizations in your area, such as English as a Second Language program, refugee resettlement organizations, etc. With that, I'll turn it back over to you, Chris, for a final wrap up.
Thank you so much, Steve. Viewers, I want to thank you for joining us today, for your feedback, for your highly active engagement in the chat. Sorry we weren't able to get to your questions. I want to thank our panel, of course, and our partners over at the Cornell Law School Migration and Human Rights Program as well. Viewers, real quick, I do need you for just a moment, or I'll ask you if you could give us a moment to provide some feedback. Let us know how we did today. Maybe give us some tips on how we might improve going forward. So again, I want to thank our panel, thank our viewers. Thank you for joining today's keynote. The recording will be available in moments from now. So thank you so much. We'll see you next time.